Good afternoon, everyone, and to those joining us remotely. Thank you for tuning in for our Shutting Down the Pathways to Girls Incarceration series. Many of you may know that we at Vera have a federal project focused on getting to zero girls in confinement in New York City, but we think that that's actually a national opportunity, and we're very excited to have New York City kind of leading charge to make that happen. And today we are lucky to have Professor Francine Sherman from Boston College Law School. She is the author of Gender and Justice, System-Level Juvenile Justice Reform for Girls. Reframes, how we might respond to girls at a systemic level through cross-system collaboration and youth development approaches. But also it's just, been a mind writing recent girls in the juvenile justice system for years and years and years, and did a lot of the research that we rely upon today to be able to make the change that we're trying to make in New York City. So without further ado, Fran is going to come join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So I've been told I need to stand within this space again. So I'm feeling a little cramped, but we'll try my best. So let me start with this slide, and I'm going to keep this on actually for the whole talk. So this is a timeline. It's a timeline of a young woman we're going to call Sonia, which is actually modeled on a real case that I had for many years. I'm going to call her Sonia, and this is essentially her time with the child and family serving systems. And what I do today is talk to you about this case, sort of grounded in her real experience, and then have a discussion about how this case is absolutely typical systems issues we're confronting, and is really a window into how to think about those issues. So, this is a typical high-need, multi-system involved girl of color. Essentially, the horizontal lines represent the different systems as they kind of fade in and out of her life based on age of jurisdiction and the framing of the issues. She's one girl, but at any moment in time, she could actually have from 3 to 8 systems involved in her life in some way, all right? The systems escalate. So used or neglected girl moves through any child welfare placements and transitions. She runs away and essentially fails up into the next level of restriction. So from the welfare system, she fails up into the status offense system. And in the status offense system, he then moves into the juvenile justice system. And unfortunately, in some states, like New York until shortly, and North Carolina, the criminal justice system as early as the age of 16. And so you can see where that comes in, all right? At some point, she has a child of her own. The child welfare system takes over again, and now she's the mother, and her child is in the child welfare system, right? Too often, from poor health, addiction, often is related to trauma, and that just complicates the picture. So multiple placements, disruptions, and all of that contributes to educational failure, right? And makes it more likely that learning disabilities will go unidentified, or that her anger or her outspoken behavior will get misunderstood and she's going to get pushed out of school. Pregnancy is actually declining, but as I said, it is not declining for this population. So the rates of teen motherhood among this multi-system involved population are high, and instead of that being treated as an opportunity, again, it just sort of repeats this cycle. The mechanics of the core process, of judicial process, such as violations of probation, violations of valid court orders, warrants for failure to appear, as well as a culture that defaults to increased levels of intervention rather than family engagement, all play a role in this process of these girls failing up through these systems to greater level of involvement. So that's the big picture, right? For a moment, I think, to pause and imagine what is going on for Sonia individually as this is happening. So what's happening is she's learning, right? Developing. She's growing up. The normal process happens for any child. And the question is, what is right? Raising her, our sister raising her, and that's exactly what's happening. And so it's really, I think, obvious but incredibly important point to think about, you know, what are the lessons she's taking away from this? What she's trying to do is figure out who she is, what her identity is, where she fits in with families, where she fits in with peers, where she fits in with her community. I told you this was a real case. And a young woman, Sonia, is now 35 years old. And we time together and she's thought about sort of what she was learning when she was younger and growing up in these systems and what were the lessons. So I just want to share some of her observations of these experiences, and then we can, you know, bring this up to sort of a big data level, right? So this is Sonia. She's 10 years old. And she's going to talk about, right? She had already spent 5 years in and out of foster homes. She was separated from her mother. She was separated from her only sibling, her brother. She's finally placed in a foster home that is actually a good foster home. And she reflects back, and she, now reflecting back, knows that it was a good foster home and describes this mother as being loving. She fed the kids. She made sure they got to church. She made sure they went to school, were showered and clean with clean clothes. The house was filled with mad foster kids, including, you know, some that just didn't leave when they turned 18, and so she let them continue on and live in the basement. But she ran from that home. She already had a pattern of running, initially back to her mom when she was 5, but she continued and she ran from that home. Adult, she was reflecting back on why she ran from this home. Now that she thinks about it, it was a good foster home. I'm going to use her words, okay? Crazy, because I would pray and cry for a family. By the time I was in a family situation, I didn't know it was a family situation. I thought it was something else. I didn't know how what family looked like. I knew it was on TV, never understood why. Even now, I didn't understand why I felt so out of place there that I left. It was a perfect foster home. She, after 5 years of disruption, bouncing around in the foster care system, she couldn't recognize or wasn't ready to experience stable home life. She never learned how to have family. She learned how to resolve conflicts, how to work things out in a family kind of setting, right? And what do we do when she behaves in a way that is absolutely predictable, given the fact that she's missed this core lesson in life of how to connect and live a family, right? What do we do? When she runs away, does she get to go back to that family and kind of work it out and get some greater understanding about conflict resolution? No. What if she loses that bed? We escalate the level of involvement. She then goes to a group home. She might go to a residential placement. And in her case, she continues to run away. And 4 years later, she was in detention. So she's exactly what we see here, right? 4 years later, now she's in the juvenile justice system. The situation, she was on the run, she was high, she was with an older boyfriend at the time. She was charged with aggravated assault. They robbed someone on the streets. Another extremely familiar pattern for young women in terms of the kind of charging and the context for the offense. She was pregnant at the time. So the justice system is raising her, right? The child welfare system didn't do a great job. Now she's failed up. She's now reflecting on her time in the juvenile justice system. So I'm going to quote her again. I was 14. I was tired of being in foster homes where I was being raped and molested, and I was tired of being, no offense, but I'm going to be honest, in youth homes where these people would throw on the floor for the smallest little thing, and the girl next to me would be white, would do something worse, and she wouldn't get restrained. If she did, she didn't get restrained as hard as I did. I would have 8 staff on me. I would be slammed to the ground until I lost my breath, and this girl would just be 3-point restrained. Okay, that's pretty technical stuff, but here's the lesson she takes away. So, you want to talk about powerlessness, then I choose to leave. But I recognize racism. None of that stuff happens. But when you're young, you don't know what it is. You think, why am I the only person? So what are you doing, right? What are you learning? She's learning that she's bad. I mean, that's the lesson she's getting from this, right? She's learning that she's bad. For some reason, she's worse than the girl next to her, right? Not seeing this, what we can sort of understand as are the societal level issues and everything else, right? So here's the thing, you know, Sonia is smart. Actually, she's extremely insightful. You can tell from some of her observations. They're kind of brilliant. She's artistic. She writes poetry. She's guarded and generous to a fault, which she would even say is some of what gets her in trouble. She's outgoing and she's actually hilariously funny. But her adult life, if you can imagine, has even been harder than her childhood. She continues to struggle with drug addiction. She's homeless. She has mental and physical health issues. She continues to be arrested and incarcerated for drugs and prostitution. Been the victim of rape and assault so many times, hard to count. Her life is unbelievably tough. Systems raised her since the time she was 5 years old and honestly did an awful job, right? Isolated case. It's important to just pause and think about what she's learned. Every day there are thousands of girls around the country who are learning exactly these same lessons, right? Who are growing up and developing in the context that's teaching them exactly what we don't want them to learn. In New York City, as Lindsay said, there's a commitment to get to zero, to shut down girls' pathways to incarceration by reimagining these intersecting youth systems and youth family-serving systems, right? And this is a great time for work like that. Be logical, it's the right place to go, and it's also really good timing because around the country, criminal justice systems are shrinking. They're down, detentions are down, and incarceration is down. Nationally, girls continue to be a small fraction of youth detained and incarcerated, 16% of detentions nationally, 13% of residential placements. Their numbers are declining more slowly than the boys, so their share of the system is increasing. In New York City, the situation's been a little bit better, and there have been more steady declines in girls' numbers. But a lot of problems remain. New York City, Black girls' misdemeanor arrest rate is 20.5 times higher than the rate for white girls for misdemeanors. The rate of arrest for Latinas is 6 times higher than that of white girls. Girls' rate of juvenile detention admissions in New York City is almost 16 times higher than it is for white girls, and the rate for Latinas is 4 times higher. 40% of teen girls identify as LBQ, gender nonconforming, or transgender. 4%. In California, that's 50%. And some preliminary data in New York City shows that about 30% of girls identify as LBQ or gender nonconforming. These at intake, so these are girls in the juvenile justice system. So it's true generally, but worth sort of thinking about that as the juvenile justice system is shrinking and are addressing those issues that are the easier issue to address, then the harder problems are the ones that remain in the system, right? So our smaller system is filled with the most challenging kinds of cases and the most challenging kinds of issues. And really where we are now around the country and where you are now in New York. And systems around the country and in New York City and New York State are finding that some of what is working to shrink the system for boys is not working in the same way or as effectively for girls. It's also not working for LGBT, gender non-conforming, transgender kids, right? So gender is a sticking point, all right? It has been. Nothing new, right? It always has been. Gender is a sticking point, and we need to be thinking about that conceptually and sort of on the ground in really concrete ways and in terms of the individual lives and the development of individual girls, right? So the question really is, how do we reimagine systems that do better for Sonia? Unfortunately, these days we're really reminded, truthfully, of how strongly rooted sexism is in our society, right? The justice system was actually built on it in many ways, if you look back at the history. And the juvenile justice system continues to perpetuate a fairly sexist and kind of unfair and gender biased structure. Actually, in New York, that gender bias was codified in law as recently as 1972. So I'm not sure people know this, but your PIN law between 1962 and 1972 had jurisdiction over girls until they were 18 years old and jurisdiction over boys until they're 16. So that you needed to have a way to sort of control girls longer than boys, that they were more in need of rehabilitation, more vulnerable. Actually, it was found unconstitutional in New York in 1972, but it reflects a very kind of cramped notion of adolescent development that favors girls' compliance over their autonomy, that favors accountability over opportunity, and that we see still throughout the system. 1972, the New York Court of Appeals found that this was unconstitutional, these different ages of jurisdiction. Institutional discrimination based on gender couldn't be justified, as the city, in that case, tried to argue, but the girls had a danger of being pregnant, and so there was going to be a burden on the welfare, the general city welfare from these unwanted pregnancies. But in rejecting the statute, actually, the court said, and I'm going to quote, "The conclusion seems inescapable that lurking behind the discrimination is the imputation that females who engage in misconduct, sexual or otherwise, ought to be more censured, that they're in their conduct subject to greater control and regulation than males." Their conclusions, laws like that. New York State was not alone. New York in having statutes like that, where these kinds of gender discrimination were sort of written into the law. And now, while that's out of the written law, it is absolutely still in the law as it's applied. Right now, what we see is a gender impact. Right? In application, there's this kind of discrimination and bias, even though it's wiped from the language. Actually, a great example for that. So girls placed out of home for being what in Massachusetts we call it being stubborn. I don't know what the language is in New York, wayward, or there's language like that, disobedient. Their conditions of release is typical, it happens around the country, and because the context of their homes and their communities that gave rise to the initial wayward or stubborn behavior are not resolved by their conditions of their own behavior, right? They continue to offend and they violate and they fail up, but it's not their failure, it's a system failure. Those were 35% of status offense placements nationally, right? Over the last decades, averaged to be 41% of status offense placements versus 13% of which is their share of placements for delinquency. So they are much higher, more present in the status offender system than they are in the delinquency system, and that's true everywhere. In New York City in 2015, girls were 58% of PINS placements. Again, a system that's being used disproportionately for girls and young women. They experience what appears to be a neutral justice system, but their experiences of it are not neutral at all. That's because the context in which girls live, some of the trauma they're experiencing, some of the social expectations that we put on them don't fit with the requirements we have in our child welfare and our juvenile justice system, or with the resources, right? We're expecting them to be compliant and obedient. There's an incredibly close connection. It's more connection, absolutely intertwined. Family stress, chronic disadvantage, and juvenile justice involvement for girls. They're absolutely 100% connected. Girls travel through the child welfare system to get to the juvenile justice system, detention, into incarceration. They move from child welfare to juvenile justice, and that's what everyone knows now called crossing over. So crossover youth are those that move through the child welfare system in one or another. It's defined differently depending on sort of how you're looking at it, but the basic idea is you move through the child welfare system, cross over into the juvenile justice system. And that's essentially what Sonia's story was, right? The failure of the foster care system, of the child welfare system, and crossed over into the juvenile, and then really essentially a life in the adult criminal system. It's kind of hard to pin down, but girls are about 40% of crossover youth nationally, which once again is much higher than their share of arrests, higher than their share of detentions, higher than their share of incarceration. So they are more present in that population that's moving from child welfare. They are more concentrated among the child welfare system failures, is basically what we're saying. In each of the last 3 years, about a third of youth who crossed over from child welfare to juvenile justice system in New York City were girls, but only about 20%. Girls comprise only about 20% of either the detained or incarcerated population. So New York's much the same. They're a much larger share of the crossover community than they are of the juvenile justice group outright. They're in foster homes, group homes, residential placements, right? Systems failing. 50% of these New York City crossover girls open investigation, worker care, or in a preventative child welfare case at the time of their arrest. These are cases of sort of chronic need in families and in communities, right? They are not cases, for this part, all right, of significant public safety risk. And the data tells us that Tonia's story is absolutely typical. So, is of inadequate family services that do not engage families, and that failure draws girls into the juvenile justice system. It's families, it's about communities, and actually the solutions are located there, the families and in the communities. It demonstrates an even more direct pathway for girls into the juvenile justice system, from fake chaos into the juvenile justice system, more direct than this one that glides through the child welfare system, and that is that girls are charged with in-home assault more often than any other offense, and in part, and more often than their male peers. And in part, this is because of sort of pro-arrest and mandatory arrest policies that are the result of the Violence Against Women Act, you know, incredibly useful and well-intended laws that actually are having an unintended consequence of driving many girls into the juvenile justice system. So according to the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS, girls comprise 40% of youth arrested for domestic violence in their home with a parent as a victim. And if you know that for both boys and girls, a same-sex peer is the most common victim of assault, but for girls, the second most common victim is a family member. In New York City, in 2015, 24% of girls' cases referred to the law department were flagged as family offenses, compared with 14% of boys' cases. Same thing we see nationally, that this issue of family chaos, girls fighting in their families, being called, the police are called, assault charges are picked up, is happening nationally, it's happening in New York as well. In the same year, assault charges accounted for 24% of girls' admissions to detention, and that was the highest offense category for detention admissions for girls. Now, girls are around 40% of juvenile arrests for domestic assault, 40% of juvenile arrests for simple assault. So this is something we're seeing around the country. So it's another way that Sonia enters, and girls like her enter the juvenile justice system, right? She experiences family chaos and trauma. She reacts in absolutely well-researched and expected ways. She fights, right? She fights back, she runs away. She has incredibly challenging interpersonal relationships. And what ends up happening is she gets arrested. In Sonia's case, she gets arrested in a foster home, and a lot of these arrests happen when the girl is already placed out of the home. From trauma to predictive behaviors to arrest is really what we've done. Right? So, you know, I think that when you're dealing in this world and with these issues, you're often sort of thinking, we got to solve this problem. You know, we shouldn't have violence against girls. Well, absolutely, we shouldn't have violence against girls. But and we should solve that problem. But what we actually control is how the systems respond to that phenomenon, right? Well, we can't solve that problem immediately. What we can do is restructure our response. I think it's important when we think about these cases to realize that we are making the decision as the adults in the room, as the people who are designing the structure, who as lawyers, as the judges, as the system administrators, we are making the decisions to behave this way and handle our cases this way, and that's actually something we can change. So actually, I'm a professor, as Lindsay said, and so as a law professor, I could have to, in May of 2017, sort of end this talk in Ray Gault. So I don't know if people know about Ray Gault, but this is the 50th anniversary of In Ray Gault. In fact, May 15th, next week, is the 50th anniversary. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about that case. It may seem a little random, but it's not, as a way of sort of concluding this talk about girls. So Gault, In Ray Gault, was decided in 1967. It's a Supreme Court case which held that juveniles charged with delinquency had a number of procedural protections, and the most significant one really is the right to counsel, and that's sort of what Gault is known for. And Gault changed juvenile practice around the country. It's hard to kind of overstate the impact of Gault. Just tell you the story for a moment so you can get a sense of where I'm going with this. Gault lived with his mother, father, and brother in Globe, Arizona, which is a small mining town about 90 miles outside of Phoenix. He was accused of making a lewd prank phone call to a Mrs. Cook. The officer picked him up and arrested him after school and took him to jail. He didn't even know, no indication when mom and brother get home of where Jerry was. He hadn't done his chores, there was no note, and they were concerned. They looked around for him and finally realized what had happened and came to court the next week. The court was presided over by a Judge McGee. There was no tape recording or other recording of the hearing. She was not represented by an attorney. Mrs. Cook was not at the hearing. She didn't testify. The probation officer testified to what Mrs. Cook told Jerry had said over the phone, and that she thought it was Jerry. And based on that testimony alone, with a procedure to speak of, they found Jerry delinquent and sentenced him to close to 6 years in the Arizona Industrial School for boys. The industrial school was essentially 100 miles out of the desert, away from Jerry's home and his family and everything that he knew, right? It was the 1960s version of what we are still doing, which is placing kids upstate or someplace far away from home in a locked facility. He'd been an adult, made a lewd phone call, exactly the same charge. The maximum penalty he could have received would have been 2 months in jail and a $5 to $50 fine, right? And Jerry Gault, the juvenile, got 6 years for his own good. So later, Jerry Gault would say, and he rarely spoke about the case at all, but years later he would say that his time in the industrial school taught how to be angry and mean. And that's the next 30 years trying to unlearn. And this idea, kids are developing. Where are they going to do it? Are they going to do it in prison or are they going to do it in a home, right? And where they do it and the context they're living in determines what they learn and how they develop. And in Jerry's case, he learned how to be angry and mean. So you don't know, in 1967, the Supreme Court decided, that his sentence was unconstitutional. He was released. He went into the Army where he served for 23 years, married, had kids, and that's the end of Jerry Gault's story. But he spent some time in state industrial school. Now, it's hard to overstate the significance of it. It's staged for a lot. And that case is actually referred to as a case that has a fairly narrow holding, but really broad reasoning. And now, in 2017, in the middle of sort of the developmental era of juvenile justice, when systems are thinking about the fact that kids are developing through systems, when courts are recognizing that there are fundamental developmental issues that are happening with kids that really drives their behavior and makes them different than adults and really requires that we have a different legal response to them, all began with Gault. You can look on Gault and you can see the beginnings of this revolution. And essentially the idea is this: to an adult, need to recognize those differences and use a developmental framework. And a big part of a developmental framework is fairness. We only have to be fair, but the system has to be perceived as fair by kids in it. And it's really critical to their healthy development. So the story of Gault is exactly the same to me. The big takeaway is very much the same as the story of Sonia. It's the importance of respecting each teen. It's the treating them fairly. And the importance of having public systems that are designed to listen to what they have to say. The basic talk, and I'd be happy to take questions. People want to talk about, the broader issues.
Thank you for this talk. So my question is in reference to kind of the share amount of girls that are involved in the justice system, and you mentioned that some of the things that are put in place to prevent the number or share of boys that are involved in the juvenile justice system. Can you kind of share a little bit more about that in terms of what interventions have applied or have worked for boys?
Right. So I think that the big for that is context, right? So what we know about the context of girls offending is different than what we know about the context of boys offending, right? So and many of the kind of interventions, approaches to probation, for example, which is a great example because like 60% of kids who are adjudicated delinquent end up on probation around the country. It's the sort of great, largest disposition. Much of what the structures are for probation have been designed around boys. The entire justice system really has been designed around boys. There has been a big push over the last couple of decades to say, let's look at development and think about that and sort of tweak these different processes so they're appropriate and they fit the context in which girls are offending, the context in which they're behaving, the context in which they're growing up. So what I've been talking about in terms of the overlap, the family situation of girls, the expectations we have for them, the dynamics in their families that they have with their parents are different than the dynamics that boys have with their parents. Very fundamental way, that's what I'm talking about, right? That whatever you do, and I guess to talk about it in sort of a larger way, the difference between the juvenile justice system and the adult criminal justice system is that the juvenile system is supposed to be individualized. It was designed to be an offense-based system. It was designed to be an offender-based system. That's the fundamental distinction, right, in the approach. That's why it isn't criminal court. It's juvenile court, right? And so what we're talking about here is really nothing more than realizing essentially the basic fundamental underpinnings of juvenile court and the juvenile justice system and juvenile dispositions, right? They're supposed to be individualized. And I'm not saying that all girls are the same, certainly not, or that all boys are the same. But what I'm saying is that we can make some sort of groupings of populations and tailor our responses so they fit what we actually know about the context of offending in these cases. So it's an answer, but that's sort of the point. And just to sort of add, some of this research is kind of old, but there is, pretty good research that shows that maybe at first disposition, girls will get a more lenient disposition from a judge, but as soon as they begin to violate conditions, sanctions kick up really fast. And that really has to do with our expectations for girls to be obedient. And I don't think that has changed enormously over decades that I've been doing this work. Used to lots of comments about attitude, about demeanor, about dress, about, how girls are comporting themselves. I don't really think that's changed. I have to get sanctioned for that. Yeah.
Your research has thought at all about, so like a lot of these systems are considering kind of efforts across the country to rely on data analytics and other forms of predictive policy making. Yeah. But the data that is being relied on is the data that you're talking about, right? That in order to target communities for, high-risk communities, they're using data that would help in their minds to indicate what a high-risk community looks like. And that data is already kind of inherently biased because it's based on the data that historically has over-policed,
right.
Of all these offenses, all of these systems is over-policing, even if they're not police, ACS, health and services, They're all very connected. So I'm just curious if you've thought of how they're going to change people's kind of interaction throughout life with these systems when they're relying on data to justify the interaction to begin with, and that data is based on the fact that people have been historically involved in those systems.
Right. No, right.
What that means.
Yeah. No. So there's there are lots of different ways to look at this whole data question, because it's really so one of the things that has historically been a problem for young women, for example, in court or in agency decisions, right, has been the unconfined and unguided exercise of discretion. Right? So discretion is another thing that makes juvenile justice different than adult criminal justice, and it's good, right? In many ways, yet discretion also is an open space for bias. And so that has been a problem. And so for that reason, many of these, I'm sure you're all familiar with these kind of risk assessments, these objective tools that are validated in different kinds of communities and different kinds of cases. And one could view it as good. It makes sense. It kind of is taking the discretion out of some of these critical decisions, right? Although they're constantly being overridden and people are still, using their discretion. So one could say that's good, but I'm going to go back to with that kind of use of data. On one hand, it can be helpful as a guide. I have, in a lot of these instruments I've looked at, I really think that, again, they're written to be gender neutral, but in their application, they don't function that way, because some behaviors that we see concentrated among young women who are in these systems, like running away, for example, for a variety of ways, the points you get for it and all these other kinds of ways that these objective tools work, you're hit hard for some of these behaviors that actually are very gendered. So there's that problem. But then that other part that you talked about, which is the over surveillance, which is true, and talk about teen mothers. That's a good example of victims of domestic violence. Why is it that women who have experienced intimate partner violence don't want to go with their children into shelters where everyone's going to be calling out every misstep with their children, right? So that's very real, and it's hard to really know what to say about that. Sometimes you think, what should we have done in Sonia's case, right? Would have been worse off if the system never removed her from her mother. You gotta wonder, because the result was pretty awful. And there is that kind of do no harm thinking sometimes, that there are many of these cases that would simply be better left alone, or simply be better diverted and directed to some community service, something that's more rooted in that community. And maybe that's the big answer to your question,
Thank you for your talk. I had a question about the document that lots of people across many fields are using around the issue of juvenile justice, particularly when we think about arguments around brain chemistry. And, I guess thinking that it really resonates even with things around battered women syndrome, or in at one point when queerness was considered a mental health issue, or women when we're on our period or we're highly emotional and should be quarantined, right? That there's a history of using biological factors or biology around development that can open up doors and also close some doors. So I guess thinking, I think what a tool in this moment to say we should people differently, what potentially 10, 15 years from now what doors could be closed in using the argument around young people having a certain developmental deficit in comparison to adults.
So you see that flip. So I have answers to your question, right? You all always see that in the concrete example of that is, what if a child's a victim? Can their testimony be relied upon if they misperceive or they're vulnerable? You say that kids shouldn't be interrogated in the same way because they're more vulnerable to pressure, yet you want to be able to believe what they say, obviously, because stuff happens to them and they need to be heard. So how do you sort that idea out, in a way? There's sort of two sides to this issue of development, right? When you think about things like competency and, right? But I don't see this as a problem. I'm going to hold that thought for a moment because I do see this on the issue of trauma for young women, the potential problem. So I am concerned with this sort of overarching narrative, girls have experienced trauma and it's all about trauma, and so we have to sort of behave differently to them because of that. And the reason that one worries me is because, it's about development. Let's think about what people are learning about themselves. Let's think about identity. Do I want my daughters to have a choice between being sort of an offender or a victim? What's someone who experienced trauma? It's not necessarily the identity you want to perpetuate either. So I see that one, and that's sort of a twist on the development discussion. Something we just have to be careful about. I mean, trauma is real, and reactions to trauma are real, and there's real science around that, and we have to be mindful of it, but we also have to be concerned about the kind of label. But in terms of the law and systems thinking about development now, what healthy development looks like. Know what developmental milestones kids are supposed to be moving through, and we know what steps they have to, go through to get to the next. And when you think about what happens with Sonia and other girls like her, they're missing. They're missing steps, being taught the steps along the way. And so they get to the next place and they don't have the foundation. And so think about development as an opportunity, right? We know what healthy development looks like. And we're not providing the sort of soil for that to happen, for sort of healthy kids to grow. So think about it that way, then really it's a guide. It's a guide for structure, how you should structure in your system.
Frank, about the ways that you engage young women in this work and the importance of their, because I think that one counter to that is we're not saying adolescents have such a deficit in development that they can't participate in decision making or anything like that.
Right. So, I'm a lawyer. I mean, I work at it from the point of view that what kids say in when you're representing young people, you represent their expressed wishes, right? So you come at it I don't know in New York, but Massachusetts, you represent their expressed wishes. And the general rule is, you are supposed to treat a minor, a client who's a minor, give them the same opportunity for client-directed representation, which is the basis of legal representation, as you would give an adult, right? You work with them and you try to figure out what it is they want, and then you go and you try to get it for them. So I do think that this sort of model of legal representation is incredibly very empowering, very client-directed, very much about sort of listening what kids have to say, and obviously, you don't sort of hear what they say off the top of their head and run and do it. It's a process of engagement and of working together and of building a relationship to try and understand what they want. But then you do it. And in this work as well, so recently what I've been doing is going back and talking to some young women who sort of grew up in these cities and are now adults. So Sonia's one example. She's sort of the older among the young women I've been speaking with. And it really has been a process of kind of saying, okay, now with a little bit of distance, how was this for you? Were those kind of important points, good and bad? And so you get what Sonia has to say. And I find it not amazing in a way. It just shows you how deep this stuff runs, that a 36-year-old can go back and she remembered exactly where that good foster home. She could give you the address. She could describe it. She knew exactly what that was and still struggled to figure out why it was she couldn't stay in that good place. And for me, that was an incredible moment, if you will, because really said a lot about this is a learning process. As someone once told me, they saw someone told me they saw a documentary about immigrants in this country, and someone had sort of captured the issue by saying, like, we don't teach them the steps to the dance, get angry at them when they can't, keep the beat and do the dance. It's very much the process. If they're growing up in her situation, no one taught her the steps. She got punished when she ran away and couldn't make, So, for me, it's constantly a process of sort of learning from young women as they're going through it, but also then their reflections back have been incredibly helpful in thinking about where we should be going with this work. Yeah.
My question would be around between somebody getting in the system and somebody who, for one, escapes the system and lives a, in brackets, normal life, going to work and doing all those sort of things. And, is really caught systemic assessment, and he is effectively just living life, but you could actually have two people having the same exact issues, same experiences. One just happens to have got caught in a misdemeanor or, and basically caught in the system. Is there any study around that? Or is there any, just as an observation, it's just one of these things, because I've come across people who basically I would deem as having traumatic childhood or whatever, but they have not. They're walking adults, they're lawyers, whatever. Right.
So what counts for resilience, and what?
Resilience is not really. I wouldn't sort of call that the real word, but for me, it's about somebody getting caught in a system where they're basically entrapped in a where somebody is operating, getting paid, and various other things, but they've still got exactly pretty much the same issues. They just haven't got caught up in a legal.
And have the same behaviors, right?
Exactly.
And it's a favorite sort of start, absolutely, and it's a favorite sort of start to some of these talks. Everyone out there who's did something stupid when they were a teenager, right? Or something that was probably criminal, raise your hand, and everyone, did something, right? And that goes to your point, to the point in the back about, but who's watched, who's arrested, who's caught up, and what are the consequences of that, right?
And then it goes back to the topic.
No question about it. I did some work in St. Louis, and in St. Louis County for a while, and in St. Louis County, basically, the nutshell, the issue was this: there was a train from St. Louis City that went into this town in St. Louis. It had a lot of shopping malls, and it was sort of a straight thing. And once they built that train, then a lot of the African American girls from St. Louis would get into that county, go into the malls, and of course, in the second they would walk into the mall, they were followed, and then they would get arrested. They would shoplift or whatever. They would get arrested, or they would horse down, and then they would be carted off to detention in St. Louis County. And I grew up in St. Louis, and I shoplifted. But I was a Jewish girl from Ladue. No one was arresting me. And, it's really, you do kind of say, come on, That's really the point. Yeah. Right. Right. A lot of people say, there's been some interesting work, for example, around push-out, the push-out girls from schools, right? So, one person's disobedience is another person's leadership, right? It's really, a piece of it is the eyes we're looking through and what we're interested in seeing. It's my understanding that schools in New York City are the sort of highest institutional reporter of child abuse, AS or wherever that gets reported, right? So what does that look like? I mean, are those opportunities maybe to promote education, to increase investment in school instead of starting down this road? Your question's a great one, but it's really it's sort of a question about society and about, yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Our last one was probably a really good one to end on. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Fran, for coming and talking with us. Work in New York City is ongoing. We're trying to get to zero. We're attending to how we understand and change what we see in the way that you're talking about. And we'd love to keep in touch with anyone in this room who wants to be part of that work. We have a sign-in sheet where you could leave your name and email. And, you know, always love to hear from you. My email is on the website. My name is Lindsay Rosenthal. I'm kind of leading this work within COJ. Our team is in the room. We'd be happy to connect with anyone who wants to learn more about what we're doing. So thank you.
Thank you. So, like, what does that look like? Someone comes to consult. I mean, would the